I've been asked to slow down when I speak and to not cover as much of the material as I normally do. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. So I'll try to make it accessible to as many people as possible. All right. So the overview, basically, what I'm going to go over is I think there are 4 things we need to do to improve. Well, there's more than 4 things, but 4 important things we could do to improve choice under existential risk and goal uncertainty are, with respect to individual decision-making, focus on success maximization as opposed to traditional expected utility maximization, especially under the context of infinite money glitches. Second, with respect to group decision-making, there should be a shift from preference-based balloting to yes and no balloting. This better reflects the group consensus. Third, we should improve the background conditions under which decisions are made. And there's a formal mechanism for doing this called Condorcet multi-agent systems. I'm not going to get into the technical version, but the simplified version is basically you want to have background institutions that promote honesty, knowledge, independent thinking, and the numerousness of agents. All this increases the quality of decisions. And then finally, we want to internalize the external costs that a lot of times happen in decision-making. And so one thing I strongly advocate is, in terms of large institutional investors and high net worth individuals, and even large numbers of retail investors, I think it's really good to promote the idea of index investing that tracks the global market capitalization, because when we do that, that internalizes a lot of the external costs that a lot of companies tend to have, and it makes sure that our profit incentive is better aligned with our general welfare. All right, so I want to give an example of existential risk being threatened by traditional expected utility theory, right? So this gentleman here is Sam Bankman-Fried, and he was famous for FTX. And before he went broke, as some of you might already know, and he had been worth over $20 billion, he had been on a podcast with Tyler Cowen, and what he was asked was like, okay, let's say you're presented with a particular bet, right? You have a coin that 51% of the times lands head, and 49% of the times lands tails. And whenever it lands heads, the welfare of humanity, however you measure that, whatever your metric is, doubles. And whenever it lands tails, the human welfare will be multiplied times 0. Basically, you'd have human extinction, right? So the question that was presented to Sam Bankman-Fried was, how many times would you flip this coin? And he probably basically did traditional expected utility calculations. We won't go into this right now. But basically, if you want, there's infinite, it's basically an infinite money glitch. It's sometimes called the cosmic coin flip. It's a variation of the St. Petersburg paradox. But basically, if you want to maximize your expected utility or the human welfare, you want to flip the coin an infinite number of times. Now, the thing, though, is that if you flip the coin once, the probability of human extinction is 49%. If you flip it twice, it's roughly 25%. It's roughly 75%. If you flip it 3 times, it's roughly 7/8, and so forth. So that if you flip it an infinite number of times, the probability of human extinction is basically 0. But he was so tied into the idea, and he's fully aware of this. Like he constantly talked about, and this is why the famous book that's written about him recently is called Going Infinite, because he's very big on this kind of risk taking. Now, we can see that this was also his behavior in trading, right? So before he was 30, he was basically went from, not 0, but from maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever, to basically, $20 billion before he was age 30 in terms of his net worth. He was hanging out with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And then by the time he was 30, all of his bets, because he was taking very aggressive bets and probably doing illegal activities, it just collapsed, and he was, arrested and doing the perp walk right there, right? And it would be one thing if he's an outlier in terms of this aggressive behavior, but that's a typical rule of thumb in terms of, like, say, for example, venture capitalism, right? So, like, it's very common in venture capital to be like, okay, I'm going to take, a lot of bets. The vast majority of them will go under, but, like, one of them is going to do really well, so I'm going to make a lot of money off it. And that's totally, that's totally fine. That's totally healthy part of capitalism and totally healthy part of the world. But the thing is, there's a couple of caveats, right? One is typically they're only, they have some safety net on the side to deal with a rainy day, usually in terms of money, right? For example, in the US, for hedge funds, if you want to invest in a hedge fund, you have to have at least $1 million in assets outside of your home, right? And then second, they're not typically dealing with infinite money glitches. So the claim I'm making here is that the typical decision-making structure, which is maximizing expected return, even under the Kelly criterion, doesn't work so well when you have an infinite money glitch. And AI, especially the goal for pursuing AGI, is basically being interpreted by a lot of people as basically an infinite money glitch, right? So this is a quote from Putin, who said, artificial intelligence is the future, not only for Russia, but for all humankind. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the leader of the world. A lot of people, a lot of countries, a lot of, companies in the tech world believe it. I mean, this is why, for example, you see, like, Meta paying, $100 million bonuses for talent, right? So this is an example of, because they honestly believe that, like, they will, they can become very, very powerful. And so it's basically an infinite money glitch. So the traditional tools for making valuations under for VC is not healthy, and the thing is, superpowers are also taking this into account, and they're using this kind of calculation and say we need an alternative to expected utility maximization to deal with these kinds of infinite money glitches. So again, I want to emphasize that VCs and AI industry are not evil. That's not the claim here. I'm just saying that there's a specific kind of vulnerability, and we want to develop tools to address that. All right, so what are some ways we're going to address it? We're going to talk about it in terms of individual decision-making, group decision-making, improving the background conditions of decision-making, and then internalizing the externalized costs of decision-makers, right? So one method to deal with the infinite money glitch is MaxiPoke, and this is not the one I'm advocating, but it helps you get an idea of where success maximization is, right? So under MaxiPoke, so under traditional expected utility maximization, payoffs have some sort of real number value, so it can be anywhere, any real number between negative infinity and infinity, right? With MaxiPoke, the payoff for each outcome is either a 1 or a 0. So it's 0 if the outcome is not good enough, and it's a 1 if it's good enough. So basically you have a utility threshold. Anything above that threshold has a 1, a payoff, and then anything below it, anything below that threshold has a 0 payoff. And then you just do the typical expected utility calculation. That's how you do. So MaxiPoke stands for maximize the probability of an okay outcome. That's the name that Nick Bostrom gave to it. Now, the problem with MaxiPoke is that it doesn't take into account goal uncertainty. So one of the problems, and this is something that you see a lot of AI researchers like Stuart Russell and others say is like a big problem we have with trying to get AI alignment is that we don't know exactly what we want because it's underdetermined and it's overfitted. So it's underdetermined in the sense that we haven't defined our moral ideas or our goals in terms of all possible contingencies. So that makes it, so then when, the AI faces contingency we haven't faced before, it's using a bad definition. And also our definitions of, moral definitions and goal definitions tend to be overfitted for a particular situation, similar to how, for example, Newtonian mechanics is overfitted for a world where things are going at sub-light speed and you're not dealing with subatomic particles, right? So, and there's several examples of where this goes. They've given in the AI literature, AI safety literature. For example, the idea of like, you try to program an AGI, that's an artificial general intelligence, to produce as many paper clips as possible, and then it turns the entire universe into a paperclip factory. And then another example is that you tell the AGI to make humans as happy as possible, and then it just provides humans a constant flow of morphine or heroin. And so the idea is that we want to avoid these kind of overfitting problems. So we have to deal with the fact that we have goal uncertainty. So that's success maximization, but I'll put it in simpler terms, and we can go to that if we want discussion. But basically the idea is you have a lottery over the set of possible definitions of success. So basically what that means is that, like, for example, if I have like 3 definitions of success, let's say that like one is that I need to make $100,000 as a firm, another is I need to make $200,000, and a third is I need to make $300,000 as a firm. I assign a probability to each of those defs. So I say like, okay, I need a probability of 1/6 of making, at least 100,000. I need to have a probability of at least 1/3 of needing to make at least 200,000, at least a probability of 1/2 to, for 300,000. And of course, the sum of all those probabilities add up to 1, right? And then we also have a lottery over a possible set of outcomes. And so success maximization, you choose the alternative that maximizes the probability of success, given that there is uncertainty about the correct definition of success, right? So in other words, kind of like maxi poke, but you also assume that there's uncertainty about the definition of success. So there's some nice properties of success maximization. So one is that it's basically a subset of von Neumann-Morgenstern utility functions, which, but restricted to an interval of 0 to 1. And then a second thing is it satisfies the 4 axioms of the von Neumann-Morgenstern theorem, and also, complies with NASH equilibrium existence. And then, nicely it deals with the infinite money glitch problems because, because the utilities are capped at basically 1, you can deal with problems like the St. Petersburg paradox and the cosmic coin toss and so forth. And then finally, because, you actually deal with the fact that, like, our goals might be uncertain, we might not have well-defined goals, what you can do is you're able to take into account that, we have goal uncertainty. So I think it addresses a lot of the issues we're going to that VCs and superpowers are going to be having in terms of dealing with these potential infinite money glitches. So the second part is, okay, well, that was individual decision making. What about group decision making? So if you look at traditional social contract theory, which is, at least in the Anglophone world of the UK and the US, the typical goal is that you want to, have ideally everybody buy into the social contract. You want unanimous consent in some sense, right? And majority rule is supposed to be a means of getting as many people as possible consenting to the, the social contract or the Constitution. And you want to minimize the number of people that have some, constitution or social contract imposed upon them, right? Now, a common interpretation of majority rule is what's called majority preference. So basically, majority preference is basically the idea that if more voters prefer X than prefer over Y than prefer Y over X, then X should be socially ranked above Y, right? Now, there's a big problem with that definition, and we can see it with this paradox of majority preference and unanimous consent, right? So let's say you have 101 people who are deserted on a desert island, and let's say that they don't have contact with the outside world, they have to figure a way to govern themselves, and they're considering 2 constitutions, Constitution X and Constitution Y, to govern themselves, right? And let's say that 51 of these people, they prefer Constitution X over Constitution Y, but they would consent to either of them, right? On the other hand, you have 50 people who prefer Y over X, but they consent only to Y, right? And let's assume that these are sincere opinions, right? Okay, so what you'll notice is that the majority preference is for X over Y. So if we interpret majority rule as majority preference, then what should happen is that we should choose X as our constitution. But keep in mind, we're choosing a constitution that's going to give us the rules for how we're going to make all our other decisions. And we're choosing a constitution that's preferred by 51 over 50, and it's a very small, slim majority. And you have a lot of people who have this constitution imposed upon them that they wouldn't consent to. On the other hand, there's 101 people that consent to Constitution Y. So there's universal buy-in into this Constitution Y. So Y has unanimous consent, which would be the dream of people like Locke and Rousseau, but by majority preference, a traditional interpretation of majority rule, it's not chosen. So this is, I think, a major paradox in terms of how people look at majority preference, because majority preference doesn't necessarily reflect consent. A second issue with majority preference, and this is already well known, for centuries, is called Condorcet's paradox, but it's that majority preference is intransitive. And so I'll give a simple example of this. Let's say you have 3 voters and 3 candidates, and say that the first voter prefers X over Y over Z, and then the second voter prefers Y over Z over X, and the third voter prefers Z over X over Y. So what you'll notice is that the majority of voters, that's the first voter and the third voter, prefer X over Y. And you'll also notice that a majority of voters, the first voter and the second voter, prefer Y over Z. And so you think, okay, well, majority preference is transitive, so, okay, so the majority prefers X over Y, majority prefers Y over Z, so clearly a majority must prefer X over Z. But that's not the case. If you look at the second and third voters, they prefer Z over X. So you have a majority preferring X over Y, Y over Z, and Z over X. Another way of putting that, that'd be like if I said 3 is greater than 2, is greater than 1, is greater than 3. It's irrational, And so similarly, majority preference is irrational. And, this even applies to like supermajority rules. So for example, you could have the rule that all voters but one prefer X over Y, but one voter prefers Y over X. The rule being that if that's the case, only one voter prefers Y over X, it has to be, but all others prefer X over Y, that X should be socially ranked above Y. That rule is intransitive, right? So majority preference is basically an irrational rule. So the voting mechanisms we should be using, I think, should be yes-no ballots, right? Because if you use, what Ayer's theorem shows is that if you have at least 3 levels of preference in your voting mechanism, then you're going to be subject to one of the following irrationals. Either you're going to be intransitive, you're going to be dependent on irrelevant alternatives. That is like the introduction of a third, roughly speaking, the introduction of a third alternative can change the social ranking of, say, X and Y, even if the individual preferences between X and Y don't change. Or you can have Pareto violations. It could be that, like, for example, everybody prefers X over Y, but Y is selected over X, for example. Or you have a dictator. That is, that voter always gets whatever is their first preference, right? And so the thing about this nice about yes-no balloting mechanisms is that they avoid this, this problem, because you only have, if you interpret in terms, technically, a Rovian framework is not the ideal way to frame it, but if you want to use the Rovian framework, basically what's happening is you only have 2 levels of preference, and so it's not subject to those irrationalities. And voting mechanisms that do their things like approval voting and, Janek's D21 method, right? So I want to give a real, this is all theoretical talk I've talked so far. I want to give a real world example where, you can see these differences occurring, right? Just a little background. Approval voting is a voting mechanism where each voter votes yes or no on each candidate, and whichever candidate gets the most yeses wins the election. So basically, I like to think of it in the traditional Lockean sense, right? In the sense that, like, each voter is deciding yes or no if they want to agree to the social contract, and whichever contract is agreed to by the greatest number of voters wins the election, right? Now, the other mechanism is called plurality voting, and that's a very common mechanism. But basically, each voter votes for only their first preference candidate, and then whichever candidate is the first preference of the greatest number of voters wins the election, right? And during the 2016 Republican primaries in the United States, there was polling done by the Wall Street Journal, basically on a monthly basis, which asked representative samples, nationally representative samples of Republican voters, basically, how would you vote in a plurality voting contest and how would you vote in an approval voting contest? And, the race had a lot of candidates, right? Had anywhere from 3 to 17, typically 6 or more candidates. And under the plurality voting contest, Trump typically won with about 20 to 25% of the first place votes. He had roughly less than a fourth of the first place votes, but that was enough to win by plurality voting. And he was consistently doing that for multiple polls, right? But he was never the approval voting winner. In fact, during the last 2 monthly polls that were conducted before Trump de facto won the nomination, he had the lowest approval rating of any of the candidates. This is among Republican voters, but he still was the plurality voting winner. What was happening was that there were several candidates that were splitting the first place, first preference among themselves so that Trump could win with relatively low general approval rating, right? And so the thing that's nice about this, about yes-no balloting, is that you avoid this problem because you can consent to any contract that you want to consent to. So you can vote for multiple candidates, so you avoid that vote splitting problem. And so basically with yes-no balloting, you overcome that problem. One way, some people, like to have visual interpretation of things. One way to think of yes-no balloting is you can think of the voter as a set, and you can think of a candidate as an element of a set. And basically, if a voter says yes to a candidate, that element belongs to that set. But if the voter does not say yes, if they say no to the candidate, then the element belongs outside of their set. So basically, if you're doing any sort of yes-no balloting, you're basically choosing the candidate that occurs at the largest intersection of sets, for those who might think in terms of mathematical settings. But yeah. And one thing I want to emphasize is that yes-no balloting is not ideologically biased. A good example of this is, for example, in 1992, the US presidential election was between 3 candidates, 2 conservative candidates and a relatively speaking liberal candidate. And the 2 conservative candidates basically split the vote among themselves and led to, the more liberal candidate winning. So I think, approval voting, if the central tendency of the population at that time had been, a right of center candidate, a yes-no balloting mechanism would have better reflected that. The point being is that yes-no balloting reflects the population of voters. So if the central tendency of the population of voters is on the right, then it'll typically select on the right. If it's on the left, it'll typically select to the left. If it's in the center, it'll choose in the center. But point being is that it reflects the center tendency of the population of voters. How do we do it? It's choosing the candidate that has the most consensus, the greatest number of voters that are consenting to it, and additionally, you can think of it as it's minimizing the number of voters who have some choice or some candidate or some social contract imposed upon them, which I think is a very important idea within the tradition of democracy. So I think we should take the idea of yes-no balloting much more seriously. So now we're proceeding to the third area, which is the background conditions under which group decision-making occurs. So one thing I'm talking about briefly here is the idea of intelligence explosion or technological singularity. So basically, this is the idea that basically knowledge, intelligence, technology will grow at an accelerating rate such that asymptotically you can approach perfect knowledge. And I think the idea of approaching perfect knowledge is a pipe dream, because I think there'd be a lot of bottlenecks along the way, even if you got to AGI. But it's widely believed that if ever humans were ever capable of creating artificial general intelligence, AGI, then they would be that AI would be able to multiply intelligence very quickly to be much smarter than humans very quickly. And so, basically the gap between the intelligence of regular humans and this AGI would be like gap between animals and humans right now, right? Something like that, roughly. So typically, the people who are considered to first propose this idea were people are often considered to be people like Ray Kurzweil or John von Neumann in the 20th century, but actually the first person to actually provide historical arguments and a mathematical model for them was the 18th century French mathematician, philosopher, and revolutionary Nicolas de Condorcet. So I'll skip over a lot of. So he did a lot of political economy work in the similar vein as, like, say, Adam Smith and David Hume. His wife actually was the first major translator of Adam Smith in France. But basically, the simplest version of the theorem is, suppose you have, and there's several versions of the theorem, and it gets very complicated very quickly, and I'm more than glad to discuss it, but I'm giving a very simplified version of this. If you have n agents confronted with a statement that's either true or false, and each agent has a probability P of correctly determining the veracity of the statement, and suppose each agent makes their judgment in a statistically independent manner, then if each agent honestly expresses their judgment where the probability of correctness is greater than 1/2 or just better than random chance, then the probability that the majority of agents is correct asymptotically and quickly approaches 1 as n increases. So another way of putting that more simply is that if agents are sufficiently honest, knowledgeable, independent, and numerous, then the probability that the majority are correct is almost 1, right? And this should make sense. Like, say you're a journalist who's confronted with some information, you want to determine whether or not that information is true or false, right? Well, if you're looking at sources, would you prefer honest sources or dishonest sources, right? Would you prefer sources that are knowledgeable or not knowledgeable, right? Would you prefer sources that are independent of each other or dependent on each other, right? Or would you prefer sources that are fewer or more numerous? So basically what Condorcet argued was that, basically using this jury theorem, was that you would have a virtuous cycle where you would have institutions brought in to improve these background conditions, and that would improve individual judgments, and then these individual judgments would improve collective judgment, and then this would be a virtuous cycle, so you could get an intelligence explosion leading to, and he was arguing like things like indefinitely lengthened lifespans and other things that you hear a lot of, like, optimistic, intelligence explosion theorists like Ray Kurzweil talk about today, right? So I'll give you some examples, right? So for example, he believed that you need to have contract law in society to enforce honesty, so this made society more honest, made individuals in society more honest, right? He argued that, we need to have universally access to education and to a free press so that we have so the agents have better knowledge, right? He thought that we should have universal suffrage regardless of race or gender because, the more agents you have with these background conditions, the better the judgment, right? And then also he argued for independence. He wanted independence. So he said for institutions for voting, he argued that we should have voting by mail instead of voting by mass assembly because he argued that if we met in mass assembly, then parties would start to be formed because it's easy to communicate, and then independent judgments would lapse because people would start voting party line instead of using their independent judgments. So what he argued was if you vote by mail in the 18th century, well, it's hard to coordinate by mail, so you're more likely to have independent judgments. So basically you want institutions that promote, these values, and of course, what's a good institution at one time might not be a good institution. Like, for example, the voting by mail isn't going to be as successful in terms of promoting independence as it was back then. But basically, the idea is you want to have background institutions that promote these qualities in agents, right? So basically, the simple version of what I'm going to say is what we roughly want is we want to have background institutions in our society and in our organizations that promote honesty, knowledge, independence, and numerousness of the agents. Now, there are some complications because there's several different versions of the theorem, but roughly speaking, that's the takeaway here. Just to give a concrete idea of like how powerful this is. If you have 10,000 individuals, each with a 51% probability of correctness, and they're statistically independent in their judgments, they'll have a probability of correctness. The majority of them will have a probability of correctness greater than 99%. Just to give you an idea of how powerful these aggregation methods can be. But in any case, let's move on to the fourth issue, which is the issue of making sure that we decision makers have stakes in decisions, right? So I want to tell the tale of two investors. So we'll say investor X and investor Y, creatively speaking, right? So let's say for investor X, their investments are primarily in one company, and let's just say it's an oil company. And then investor Y, their investments are primarily like in a low-cost index fund that tracks global market capitalization, right? So because, and let's also assume that the goal of these investors is just to maximize profit. So we're not going to assume like they have any sense of goodwill or not, which to some degree I think people do have some sense of goodwill. But let's just say their goal is to maximize their individual profits, right? Okay, well, the person that's invested in Investor X, who's invested primarily in the oil company, well, actually I need to back up. So the oil company has this proposal for the shareholders where they're going to basically make a lot of profit, but it's going to cause a lot of pollution. There'll be an external cost for the company, right? So for the Investor X, their main investment, their main source of profit is the success of that company. So their thinking is, okay, well, this is going to maximize my profits, and given that we've oversimplified and said they're just only concerned about maximizing profits, they'll say, okay, we should just vote for this in favor of this proposition because it's going to maximize profits, even though it's going to have a lot of external costs of pollution, right? Okay. Now the second investor, Investor Y, they have shares of this oil company, so they can vote on it, and they will generate some profit from the action. But also, they have shares in other companies. For example, they might have shares in health insurance companies that will have losses because of the activity of the oil company. So when they think about how to maximize their profits, they're thinking, how am I going to maximize the profits of my entire portfolio? So because of that, because the externalized costs of the oil company have been internalized by other companies, their notion of what's going to their profit incentive is better aligned with whatever. We can have different definitions of social, but in a better sense of like what's good for the social good, right? Using a hand-wavy notion of that, right? So basically, Investor X, because they're primarily invested in one company, they can basically avoid externalized costs. Because Investor Y has diversified investments, they internalize the costs, and it's easier for them to have decisions that are better aligned with the profit incentive, right? So basically, the idea of universal ownership, universal in the sense that you try to own all. What you want to do is you want to encourage, high net worth individuals and large institutional investors, and even large numbers of retail investors to try to invest via, index funds that track global market capitalization, because this makes sure that the investor has stakes in basically, all the companies in the world and all the business in the world, right? And and the thing, so the traditional quote-unquote ESG investing arguments has been buy things at companies that do good things and sell companies that do bad things, but there's been a lot of evidence over the decades that it's not really good as an investment strategy to maximize profits. But index investing has been demonstrated for several decades of research. I mean, John Bogle, Paul Samuelson, several top-line researchers demonstrated that it's a very, actually, in the investment literature, they call meeting the market average, which is basically the strategy, as beta. And you're only a great investor if you can beat the market average, right? And so it's consistent. For example, there was a study done where, and this was during the time when the S&P 500 was a better track of global market capitalization, that basically, from the 70s to the 2000s 30-year period, where basically, there were only 3 mutual funds in the U.S. that beat the S&P 500 over that 30-year period. So basically, it's overwhelmingly considered a really good, investment strategy. So basically, by having this universal ownership, again, universal in the sense that you have shares in basically all the companies, we're basically better aligning profit incentive with however you want to define social good with social good. And also you're making it do in a way that, so you want to encourage companies to do that. So then when decision makers are making decisions, when sovereign wealth funds are making decisions, it's done in a way, hopefully, that's better aligned with general needs. So I'll basically repeat what I said at the beginning. So basically, what we want to do is, in terms of individual decision making, especially with respect to infinite money glitches, we want to use the tool of success maximization. With respect to group decision making, we want to shift from preference-based balloting to yes/no balloting, so that we can get consensus and minimize the number of people who have some decision imposed upon them, in the tradition of people like Locke. Third, we want to ideally kind of democratize our intelligence explosions, so improve the background conditions of decision making, primarily through, typically in terms by improving honesty, knowledge, independence, and the numerousness of agents. in decision-making, and so having institutions that promote those things, right? And then fourth, we want to encourage, individuals, high net worth individuals and VCs and, sovereign wealth funds, so forth, to try to invest in everything because it's a very successful strategy, but to second, it basically internalizes a lot of the externalized costs and makes profit incentive better aligned with, our, whatever you define as social good with social good. So that's basically it. I'm ready for questions.
Work. Okay, we can only take, because of time, 1 to 2 questions, and Karel has the first one I saw even during the presentation already.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to say I pretty much agree with most of what you said, but at the beginning, just the example that you gave, maximizing utility, maximizing expected utility, better said, is not maximizing expected value. The example you gave was maximizing expected value. That's the St. Petersburg paradox. And if we talk about maximizing utility, this doesn't happen. In fact, you even mentioned the word Kelly, right? Kelly is like log utility, you can have fractional Kelly, power utility functions. So I believe that in there, theoretically optimal would be to maximize the expected utility. What is the practical problem is that we do not know the probability distribution, the underlying distribution, so we are not able to do that very correctly. And in that sense, I agree that, and this is actually also part of T21, that it is practically good to make the 0-1 distribution acceptable or not, although I think we should point out the possible weaknesses, because again, it is the assumptions of underlying distribution. So for example, what is not good enough? Is it like just undesired, or is it catastrophic? Yeah, so it is just some details to it. It is important always to, in practical example, when we apply it, to look at the possible outcomes and how it's distributed.
Yeah. I think most of your comments are, more or less on target. I mean, one thing I want to emphasize is I think it's always good to look at tools as heuristics and not as end-all be-alls of things, right? And so I think the main point I want to make is that in terms of infinite money glitch problems, like something like people like think like AI is going to, you can take over the world if you control an AGI or invent an AGI, right? When you have these infinite money glitches, expected utility, expected return, it's questionable, and you want to use, I think, something that's where it's easier to make sure, more likely we're not going to go to extinction, basically. So I think it's a good heuristic in that situation, primarily. Yeah. All right. Other question.
So my question would be more regarding the universal ownership. So imagine a world sort of like almost a post-scarcity world in which universal ownership, in the sense that you describe it, comes to be. So you have most of the population being shareholders, active shareholders of companies. Wouldn't that be sort of the private sphere, the market institution taking over the role of the state in many ways? And would you perhaps expect like a conflict between state and market authority when you get sort of universal basic income wealth distribution almost suddenly carried out by the private sphere?
Yeah. So one thing I have. So let me give an analogy, right? So, for example, if you tell me if Carl Magnus were supposed to play against, DeepMind in chess, who would win? I can predict that very easily. I'll say DeepMind's going to crush Carl Magnus, even though he was the world champion, right? Human world champion. But if you ask me, how is he going to defeat him? I'll be like, I have no idea. Because if I did, I would know how to play. So one thing, I think there's probably within the next 10 years, probably, I think I could be wrong, of course. I'm wrong on a lot of things, but I think there's probably better than 10% chance, better than a 50% chance we'll get some form of AGI in the next 10 years. Now, I could be wrong on that, but point being is that now once we have AGI, I honestly don't know what's going to happen with the world. It's mathematically, like in the mathematical sense of chaotic, it's mathematically chaotic to me. So it would depend on the very specific situation under which, you know, the situation you were mentioning occurred, that I could give, like, if you want to give like a very specific situation, and then I could respond to that, but I don't know exactly how, I don't have a general theory of like how to deal with different, you know, potential situations.
Yeah, well, I just thought about the second order effect of a universal ownership when everyone is invested in the private market and like relies on it for like their life basically. And sort of suddenly you have the private sphere taking over the traditional role of the state, for example, as it is in Europe, of the of the strong social state.
Yeah. So one thing I want to emphasize in terms of the notion of, because I actually don't like the word universal ownership, but that's what the name of it in the literature is, so that's the word I'm using. But when they say universal ownership, what they mean is that the owner has ownership of basically all the companies in the world, some share in all the companies in the world. It's not the claim that everybody should be a shareholder, right? Now, I think it would be a good thing that if more people became shareholders, then they could take their concerns into account. But But yeah, I just first want to make that distinction. That universal ownership doesn't imply that everybody owns all companies. But then, in terms of the private-public divide, I mean, to some extent that already happens because, for example, a lot of retail investors have accounts with Vanguard and Fidelity, and they already own like index funds that track a large So like, I think, I mean, I haven't thought through all possible situations. So I can't give it like a general answer, but I would just say from my relatively, because I haven't thought about your specific question too deeply, I would say I'm not too concerned about that. Because I think that there would probably be some sort of regulation. There's a major issue, but I might not be understanding your question properly. So if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them in discussion or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question.
Hello. I hope I'm getting all this correctly, so my question is not too stupid. But generally, your example of people living on an island or the investors, I guess that the system you are proposing could be also kind of misused, or because then what could happen is that there would be a 51% majority that is for candidate A, but in case of candidate A is not acceptable to the rest, they would be having a second choice of someone they don't want really, but who is acceptable to them. And then in your system, thanks to the minority, basically you can end up with a candidate that is not acceptable to the majority. And in terms of business, I have very many personal experiences when majority of people want to play it safe, so they take safe decisions, while bold decisions are necessary. And I generally do think that your system would allow mediocre solutions that are less controversial, but may not be the best. That's my general take on it. Is it? Do you think, or this is possible or not?
So I would say this, right? So that's a common critique of yes/no balloting is, oh, there's not enough diversity of opinion, and it doesn't, But what I'd say is, I think of this from the democratic perspective in the sense that, well, first of all, if people think that something really tragic is going to happen, then typically they'll say no to a given option, right? And second, you're maximizing the number of people that consent to the winning option, and you're minimizing the number of people who have some decision imposed upon them. And I think, one of the big pushes for democracy in the 18th century, people like Locke and Hume and Condorcet was, Locke was in the 17th century. But point being is that with these folks is that you want to minimize the number of people who have something imposed upon them to which they didn't consent to. And so I think that's a very strong and powerful value. And if you feel that something is too bland or too mediocre, then the voter can just be like, well, I don't consent to it, I mean, the way you can think of decision is basically being a contract. Like when you're thinking of not contract negotiations, if you're considering many different potential contracts, in some sense, you might have a utility function that maps to each one, and then, or like how much money you make off of it, right? And then, if you're going to agree to a contract or not, you'll be like, well, does it make more than this amount of money, or does it make? And if it does, then you're going to agree to it. If it does less, then you don't agree to it. And I think, I mean, we have contracts in all sorts of society, all parts of society, and it's very useful. I mean, heck, it helps enforce honesty. So, I mean, I think it's a reasonable mechanism. And again, if people think that a choice is going to be mediocre, it's going to be too bland or whatever, they can always say no to it. It's allowing each person to self-determine their notion of what they're willing to consent to and what they're not willing to consent to. And I think that's very important, is giving that autonomy to people as opposed to imposing it from like some, from high on end, but yeah. All right.
Okay, thank you very much, Mahendra, for the whole presentation and for the questions.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.